For years, the garden behind her suburban home had been more than a patch of soil. It was a sanctuary, carefully crafted, nurtured, and defended from the chaos of the outside world. Neighbors often whispered about its beauty, though some saw it as too much for the uniform streets of the neighborhood. Rows of hydrangeas, roses, and lavender framed a winding stone path. A small koi pond glimmered in the afternoon sun. Wind chimes swayed softly, carrying a tune of peace. To her, the garden was not just decoration, it was therapy. The homeowner had poured her grief into this soil. Years earlier, she had lost someone she loved deeply, and the silence that followed was unbearable. Every bloom she coaxed from the earth became a reminder that life could still push through darkness. When depression threatened to choke her spirit, planting new seeds reminded her that time, patience, and love could create beauty again. But in this neighborhood, beauty was never left alone. The HOA, the Powerful Homeowners Association, had other ideas. They were obsessed with conformity. Identical lawns, identical mailboxes, identical paint colors. The bylaws dictated everything from the height of shrubs to the shade of mulch. Anything unique was considered a threat to the aesthetic harmony of the community. And her lush, thriving sanctuary was not in their vision. It began with warnings. A letter slipped into her mailbox, crisp and cold, stating her landscaping was not in compliance with neighborhood guidelines. She ignored it at first, assuming it was a mistake. Weeks later, another letter arrived. This time, the language was sharper, accusing her of disturbing uniformity and warning of fines. She paid no mind. After all, how could roses and hydrangeas disturb anyone? But the HOA did not operate with kindness. They escalated quickly. The fines appeared first, $50, then $100, then $500. Each one struck like a hammer, designed not only to punish but to break her resolve. When she refused to pay, they threatened legal action. Still, she stood her ground. The garden was hers, not theirs. And then, one morning, she woke to destruction. Where there had once been rows of delicate flowers, only shredded stems remained. The koi pond was drained, the wind chimes smashed. Soil was overturned as though a storm had clawed through, but there had been no storm. It was deliberate, human hands ripping apart years of devotion. The HOA had sent contractors. Under the guise of enforcement, they had torn down her sanctuary. In place of her garden, they left bare dirt and cold silence. The grief returned with a force she hadn't felt in years. The loss was staggering, not just of plants and decorations, but of the living reminder of her healing. She collapsed into the empty soil that night, holding the broken roots in her hands. But grief, this time, did not consume her. Something darker replaced it. If they wanted war, she would give it to them. Not with lawyers, not with arguments, but with a performance so disturbing that the neighborhood would never forget what the HOA had done. She would turn the ruins of her sanctuary into a stage. And the play would be a crime scene. As the sun set that evening, her plan began to take shape. She would not rebuild the garden. She would transform it into something unforgettable, an eerie, unsettling tableau that would twist the HOA's obsession with control into a nightmare they could never contain. The garden had been her sanctuary. Now it would become their curse. And with that decision, the first seed of revenge was planted. The neighborhood slept quietly, but inside her home, a storm was brewing. The woman sat at her kitchen table with a notebook, sketching, scribbling, crossing out, and rewriting. Her mind moved with precision. If the HOA had vandalized her sanctuary, she would rebuild, but not in the way they expected. This would not be a garden of peace. It would be a stage, and every detail would speak of violence, loss, and the unsettling truth of control gone too far. Her plan wasn't just about decoration, it was about symbolism. If they wanted to destroy beauty, she would give them ugliness. If they wanted conformity, she would give them chaos. And if they wanted to silence her, she would make her silence echo louder than any words. She began with research. Hours turned into days as she studied crime scene photos, forensic reconstructions, and investigative reports. She learned the careful placement of evidence markers, the yellow and black caution tape stretched in deliberate lines, and the way investigators staged scenes before photographs. She devoured the details with a cold determination. Then she went shopping. Not at garden centers anymore, but at hardware stores, surplus outlets, and online suppliers. She ordered rolls of caution tape, orange traffic cones, chalk spray, fake evidence markers, and plastic tarps. She filled her cart with gardening supplies too, dark mulch, crimson-stained wood chips, thorny vines, and plants that looked sinister in the right light. To the casual eye, it might have seemed like she was preparing for renovations. But she was planning a spectacle. On a damp Saturday morning, when the air carried the smell of rain, she stepped into her yard with gloves, tools, and boxes of supplies. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains, curious but cautious. They had seen the destruction left by the HOA's contractors. Now, they watched as she bent over the soil with the same devotion as before, but her movements had changed. There was no softness in her hands, only sharp intention. First came the outlines. With white spray chalk, she drew human-sized silhouettes across the dirt where her koi pond had once been. Each outline was deliberate, stretched at odd angles, giving the impression of fallen bodies. At their heads, she placed numbered evidence markers, just like in real investigations. From the street, anyone passing by could see them. Next came the props. She hammered stakes into the ground and strung yellow caution tape from corner to corner, fencing off the yard like an active crime scene. She set up floodlights with motion sensors, so at night the garden would glow with an eerie brightness, catching every detail in sharp relief. When the wind blew, the tape snapped and flickered, adding to the illusion of urgency. She poured red mulch across the outlines, letting it seep like pools of dried blood. Dark vines twisted along the fence posts like veins. Broken garden tools, rusted, sharp, and bent, were arranged beside the chalk figures, resembling discarded weapons. In one corner, she planted rows of jet-black petunias and blood-red dahlias, their unnatural colors glaring against the pale soil. The plants looked less like flowers and more like warnings. Neighbors began to whisper louder now. Some thought it was art, others thought it was madness. But all agreed on one thing: it was unforgettable. At night, the transformation was even more powerful. Motion lights snapped on whenever someone passed, illuminating the outlines and casting long shadows across the dirt. The caution tape glowed under the beams. From the street, it looked less like a yard and more like the aftermath of a terrible event. Cars slowed down, drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse. Children clutched their parents' hands tighter when walking by. The HOA noticed too. Within a week, letters began arriving again. This time, the language was frantic. They accused her of creating a disturbance and damaging neighborhood reputation. They demanded she remove the display immediately. But she ignored them. For every letter they sent, she added another detail to the scene. She planted tall, thin cypress trees around the edges, their shadows resembling sentinels. She scattered broken bricks near the chalk outlines, suggesting a collapse or violent impact. And in the center, where her koi pond had been, she erected a small wooden cross wrapped in barbed wire, a grim centerpiece that gave the entire yard an air of finality. The HOA threatened fines again. They threatened to sue. But this time, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood itself began to divide. Some residents were horrified, complaining that children were having nightmares and visitors were asking uncomfortable questions. But others saw it differently. They whispered about the injustice, the destruction of her sanctuary, the cruelty of the HOA, and now, the poetic way she was fighting back without uttering a single word. To them, the crime scene garden wasn't vandalism, it was protest. Local teenagers began sneaking out at night just to take photos in front of the display. Social media posts spread quickly. The crime scene garden lady became a trending topic in town. Strangers drove through the neighborhood just to see it. The HOA's attempts to silence her had backfired. Her message had grown larger than they could contain. But she wasn't finished. The garden was only the stage. Now, she needed the performance. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened, she walked through her yard with a lantern in hand. She inspected every detail, adjusting a marker here, a piece of tape there. And then she placed her final touch, a mannequin head, half buried near the wooden cross, its face smeared with dirt. It was grotesque, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. By the next morning, the garden wasn't just eerie. It was terrifying. The HOA called an emergency meeting. They wanted it gone. But the woman had no intention of surrendering. She had transformed her grief into power, and her power into a spectacle. Every threat they sent her only fueled the story further. What they didn't know was that the performance had only reached its first act, because she was about to escalate in ways they couldn't imagine. And soon, the HOA wouldn't just be fighting against her yard, they would be fighting against the growing weight of public opinion, the whispers of neighbors, and the spotlight of attention they had desperately tried to avoid. The crime scene garden was alive. And it was just beginning to haunt them. The crime scene garden had already become a local legend, but what happened next turned it into a battlefield. At first, the HOA assumed their letters and fines would scare her into compliance. That had always worked before. Most homeowners buckled under the pressure, paying their penalties and quietly falling back in line. But this time was different. The more they demanded, the stronger her display became. Every new threat was met with another prop, another sinister addition, another reminder that she refused to bow. The HOA's leadership panicked. Their pristine, cookie-cutter neighborhood was slipping out of their control. Visitors drove slowly down the street with cell phones pressed to their windows. Social media feeds filled with pictures of chalk outlines glowing under floodlights, tagged with phrases like #CrimeSceneGarden and #HOA-Nightmare. Local bloggers picked up the story, framing it as a battle of individuality versus oppressive conformity. The HOA had wanted silence. Instead, they had created noise. Soon, neighbors were forced to take sides. On one hand, there were those who despised the display. They argued that it frightened children, lowered property values, and made their community look like a war zone. These residents flooded the HOA's meetings, demanding swift action, calling her display a public menace. But then there were the others, the quiet, simmering group who had always resented the HOA's heavy hand. They saw her act as defiance, a rebellion they had secretly longed for but never dared attempt. Her crime scene garden became their symbol of resistance. They admired her courage, whispering about her bravery at backyard barbecues, waving at her with subtle nods when they passed by. Some even left anonymous notes of support at her doorstep. The HOA didn't just face one woman anymore. They faced division. As the tension grew, the woman continued to escalate her design. She added jagged shards of glass around the edges of her flower beds, sparkling ominously in the sunlight like broken evidence. She draped black fabric from her fence posts, fluttering like tattered crime scene tarps. And on one particularly stormy night, she installed an old speaker hidden in the bushes, programmed to play faint, distorted static whenever motion lights triggered. The effect was chilling. Anyone walking by would hear the crackle of an unseen radio, as though investigators were still working the scene. The neighborhood could no longer ignore it. The street that had once been identical to every other suburban road now carried a weight of unease. Guests hesitated before parking nearby. Children whispered about it at school, daring each other to ride their bikes past the yard after dark. Delivery drivers rushed their packages to her door, glancing nervously at the outlines painted on the ground. The HOA board convened in desperation. They considered legal action, but their lawyers warned of the risks. She wasn't technically breaking laws. Her display, bizarre as it was, fell into a gray area of expression. The more they pushed, the more attention they attracted. If they sued and lost, their authority would crumble completely. Instead, they doubled down with harassment. Fines escalated into the thousands. Threatening notices appeared weekly. Volunteers patrolled the neighborhood, snapping photos of her yard from every angle. The HOA president himself knocked on her door, leaving printed copies of mandatory compliance forms taped to her window. But she did not flinch. Each notice went unanswered. Each fine went unpaid. Each threat was met with silence. And her silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations picked it up, sending camera crews to capture footage of the infamous yard. Interviews aired with neighbors, some outraged, others supportive. One segment called her the woman turning HOA rules into suburban horror. Another dubbed her the rebel gardener. With each broadcast, the HOA's reputation worsened. What they saw as discipline, the public saw as cruelty. And what they saw as rebellion, the public saw as art. For the woman, the attention was both empowering and dangerous. She had never sought fame, only justice. But the spotlight was now fixed firmly on her, and the HOA was not backing down. The war was no longer about flowers or fines. It was about power, and both sides were determined to win. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood at the edge of her yard and surveyed her work. The outlines, the markers, the lights, it was all in place. The garden no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a permanent crime scene, frozen in time, daring anyone to erase it. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The HOA would not accept defeat quietly. They would escalate further, finding new ways to force her compliance. And when they did, she would need to be ready. The neighborhood had already turned into a stage. The players had taken their sides. The story was unfolding, and there would be no easy ending. What neither she nor the HOA knew was how far this battle would spiral, and how many lives it would entangle before it reached its breaking point. The garden had started as a sanctuary. Then it became a protest. Now it was a symbol. And symbols are not so easily destroyed. The HOA had underestimated her resolve. They had believed that fines, threats, and intimidation would wear her down. But weeks had passed, and the crime scene garden only grew stronger, darker, and more captivating. For the board, this was no longer just an issue of compliance, it was a battle for authority. And they were losing. Behind closed doors, meetings turned into shouting matches. Board members argued about strategy while homeowners stormed in demanding answers. Some wanted to escalate legal action, while others feared public backlash. Each news story painted the HOA as villains, their reputation tarnished further every day. Yet, in their minds, there was still one truth. If they allowed her display to remain, their power over the community would crumble. And so, they struck back. It began with surveillance. Residents noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked along the street, men with cameras recording the yard from different angles. The HOA insisted they were documenting violations, but neighbors whispered about stalking, intimidation, and harassment. At night, the woman saw flashes of cameras through her blinds, shadows lingering too long at the edges of her property. But instead of fear, it fueled her determination. If they wanted to watch, she would give them something unforgettable to see. Then came the citations. Dozens of them, piling up week after week. They accused her of noise violations, improper lighting, unsanctioned fencing, and public endangerment. Each letter carried threats of escalating fines, each one written in cold, bureaucratic language. But she didn't respond. She let them stack on her kitchen counter, a tower of paper that symbolized their desperation. Finally, the HOA made their boldest move yet. On a quiet morning, when the sun had just broken the horizon, a team of landscapers arrived in unmarked trucks. They carried shovels, saws, and heavy machinery. Their orders were clear: dismantle the crime scene garden once and for all. The sound of engines roared through the street. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, watching as men in safety vests marched toward her yard. They cut down the caution tape, ripped the markers from the ground, and began tearing at the outlines painted into the soil. The wooden cross was toppled, the floodlights smashed. Within minutes, months of her work was being erased under the force of strangers' hands. But what the HOA hadn't expected was the reaction. The woman stood silently on her porch, arms crossed, her face expressionless. She didn't fight them, didn't scream or protest. She simply watched. Her silence was louder than any argument. And her neighbors, those who had come to admire her defiance, reacted for her. Phones appeared in every hand. Cameras recorded every moment. Photos and videos flooded social media, capturing the destruction in real time. HOA destroys crime scene garden trended across platforms within hours. Comments poured in condemning the HOA for overreach, for bullying, for silencing artistic expression. What they had hoped would end the spectacle only magnified it, spreading her story far beyond the neighborhood. By evening, local news vans lined the street. Anchors reported live from the scene, their voices heavy with disbelief. Some residents gave interviews, their faces blurred, admitting their fear of the HOA's power. Others defended her outright, calling the destruction proof of the board's obsession with control. And through it all, she remained silent. But silence did not mean surrender. That night, long after the trucks were gone and the cameras had left, she returned to her yard. The soil was torn, the props destroyed, the caution tape reduced to scraps. But beneath the rubble, the spirit of her protest remained. She walked the perimeter slowly, her lantern casting shadows over the broken earth. And as she moved, a plan began to take shape, a darker, bolder vision than before. If the HOA thought they had silenced her, they were wrong. She would rebuild, not smaller, not weaker, but louder. The destruction had given her new material, new angles, new ways to twist the scene into something more disturbing than they could imagine. Over the next week, deliveries arrived at her doorstep. Black soil, charred wood, rusted metal, mannequins, and industrial lighting. She worked in silence, her movements deliberate, her vision clear. Neighbors once again watched from their windows, curiosity mingling with unease. When she was finished, the garden no longer resembled a protest. It resembled a battlefield. Where outlines had once been, now lay full figures, life-sized mannequins positioned as though caught mid-tragedy. Some sprawled across the ground, half buried in soil, their clothes shredded and stained. Others leaned against broken beams, heads tilted at unnatural angles. Rusted shovels protruded from the earth like weapons abandoned in haste. A torn tarp fluttered in the breeze, painted with streaks of crimson. The wooden cross returned, taller this time, wrapped not in barbed wire but in chains, its shadow stretching across the entire yard at sunset. The floodlights blazed brighter than before, casting sharp beams that made the figures appear alive at night. And the static-spewing speaker returned too, joined by a low, pulsing hum that echoed like a heartbeat whenever motion sensors triggered. The effect was chilling, more immersive than before. It was no longer a crime scene, it was a graveyard. The neighborhood erupted. Some residents were horrified, demanding police intervention. Others applauded quietly, leaving small gifts at her doorstep in solidarity. Children dared each other to sneak closer at night, but most refused. Cars stopped more frequently, headlights lingering too long. And once again, the HOA's letters arrived, thicker, angrier, more desperate. They had tried to destroy her protest. Instead, they had inspired its rebirth, fiercer than ever. And as the woman stood at her window, watching neighbors whisper and cameras flash, she knew one thing for certain. The HOA had escalated the war. But she held the upper hand. Because while they relied on rules, paperwork, and force, she relied on something more powerful: spectacle, symbolism, and silence. And spectacle always wins. The HOA had thought the destruction of her garden would silence her. Instead, it had unleashed something far more unsettling. The new display was not just eerie, it was terrifying. What had once been a symbolic protest had now transformed into a full-blown nightmare yard. From the street, the mannequins looked disturbingly lifelike. Their positions suggested violence frozen in time, their clothes tattered, their faces smeared with dirt and crimson paint. At night, under the floodlights, they seemed to shift, shadows crawling across the ground like restless spirits. The pulsing hum, mixed with the crackle of static, gave the impression of an investigation still underway, as though the garden itself refused to let go of its secrets. Neighbors no longer whispered, they argued. Some demanded that the police intervene, calling it a public disturbance. Others defended her right to express herself, pointing out that she had broken no actual laws. The divide grew sharper with every passing day, the neighborhood torn apart not just by fear but by principle. And the HOA? They were furious. Behind closed doors, the board drafted their boldest plan yet. They had tried letters, fines, intimidation, even destruction. Nothing had worked. The only option left was full legal assault. They filed lawsuits, accusing her of violating community standards, creating hazardous conditions, and inflicting emotional distress on residents. Their language was sharp, their demands absolute. Remove the display or face ruin. But they had miscalculated. Because by the time their lawsuits reached the courts, her story had gone far beyond their control. National news outlets picked up the tale. Talk shows debated it. Bloggers framed it as a battle between individuality and oppression, art and conformity, courage and control. Supporters flooded her social media with messages of encouragement. Donations poured in from strangers who wanted to help her fight back. What had started as one woman's silent protest had grown into a movement. Still, the HOA pressed forward. They hired lawyers, investigators, even public relations firms to manage the narrative. But every move they made only drew more attention to their heavy-handedness. The more they tried to bury the story, the louder it grew. Meanwhile, she remained silent. She gave no interviews, no statements, no explanations. Her voice was her garden, and it spoke louder than any words could. Every mannequin, every chain, every broken shovel screamed defiance. And the world listened. But the board was not finished. They escalated again, this time with force. Late one evening, long after most of the neighborhood had gone to sleep, unmarked trucks rolled down the street once more. This time, it wasn't contractors with shovels. It was a private security team hired by the HOA. Their mission was simple: dismantle the display in the dark, before cameras could catch them, before the news could spread again. But they hadn't anticipated the watchful eyes of the neighborhood. It was a group of teenagers who saw the trucks first. They had been daring each other to ride past the yard at night, their phones ready to capture the eerie glow. Instead, they captured something else entirely: the arrival of masked men with flashlights and tools. They filmed as the men cut through the caution tape, began dragging mannequins to the curb, and smashed the floodlights. The video hit the internet before the trucks had even finished. By morning, it had millions of views. Headlines screamed about HOA vigilantes destroying crime scene garden in the dead of night. Public outrage exploded. Even those who had disliked the display were unsettled by the secrecy, the brute force, the sense of power abused. The woman awoke to find her garden in ruins once again, pieces of mannequins scattered, soil overturned, props broken. But unlike before, she did not see loss. She saw opportunity. This time, she didn't need to rebuild. She simply documented. She photographed the wreckage, the shattered props, the footprints left behind in the soil. She posted nothing herself, but her neighbors did. They shared the destruction widely, their captions dripping with anger. They went too far. This is not justice. This is harassment. The HOA is out of control. The board had crossed a line, and the community knew it. Meetings grew hostile. Residents who had once supported the HOA now shouted at them, accusing them of tyranny, of wasting resources, of embarrassing the neighborhood. Board members resigned under pressure, unable to withstand the backlash. Those who remained doubled down, desperate to maintain control, but their grip was slipping. And in the center of it all stood the woman, silent, steady, unyielding. She did not rebuild the mannequins this time. She left the wreckage as it was, a scar across the neighborhood, a reminder of what had been done. The broken cross, the scattered figures, the torn tape, all of it remained haunting and undeniable. Her silence spoke again. This time, it said, "You can destroy the garden, but you cannot destroy the message." The HOA's breaking point had arrived. Their authority, once absolute, was now fragile, crumbling under the weight of outrage. They had tried to crush her, but in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. But even as the neighborhood shifted, even as the board weakened, one truth lingered: the battle was not over. The HOA was wounded, desperate, and unpredictable. And desperate people often make their most reckless moves when cornered. The woman knew this. She watched from her window as residents argued in the streets, as board members scrambled to salvage their reputation. She knew the end was coming, but whether it would bring peace or chaos, she could not yet tell. The garden had started as sanctuary. Then it became a crime scene. Then a battlefield. Now, it was a graveyard of broken symbols. And yet, its power had only grown. The neighborhood was no longer the same. What had once been a quiet, cookie-cutter community of manicured lawns and identical mailboxes had become a battleground. The HOA, once feared, now staggered under the weight of scandal. The woman's crime scene garden, torn down, rebuilt, and torn down again, had transformed into something larger than anyone had imagined. The board was fractured. Resignations had piled up after weeks of public outrage. Lawsuits dragged through the courts, but each one only further exposed the HOA's obsession with control. Neighbors who had once feared speaking against the board now stood openly in defiance, emboldened by the spectacle they had witnessed. The community itself was split, some yearning for order, others savoring their newfound freedom. And through it all, the woman remained silent. She did not appear on television, did not grant interviews, did not speak at town halls. She simply lived behind her windows, watching as the chaos unfolded. Her silence had become its own legend, a presence that carried more weight than any statement. But the HOA, though weakened, was not gone. Their pride demanded one last stand. In the final weeks of summer, a special vote was called. Flyers were shoved into mailboxes, urging residents to take back the neighborhood and restore dignity. The meeting was scheduled in the community hall, a place usually reserved for potlucks and birthday parties. Now it would decide the future of the neighborhood. The night of the meeting, cars packed the streets. Neighbors filed in, faces tense, voices low. Reporters waited outside, cameras ready. The board members sat stiffly at the front, papers stacked high, their expressions tight with exhaustion. And at the center of it all was the woman, arriving late, walking silently through the crowd. Every head turned as she passed. She did not speak, did not acknowledge the whispers. She simply sat, her presence enough to command the room. The meeting began with formality, accusations read aloud, legal jargon thick in the air. The board painted her as disruptive, reckless, dangerous. They claimed property values had plummeted, children had been traumatized, the neighborhood's reputation ruined. Their words were sharp, desperate, each syllable clinging to the last shreds of authority they had left. But when the floor opened for residents, the tide turned. One by one, neighbors stood to speak. Some voiced anger at the display, their fear genuine, their frustration raw. But many more defended her. They spoke of freedom, of expression, of the suffocating grip the HOA had held over their lives for years. They recounted fines for trivial infractions, threats over minor details, the endless control disguised as order. Her crime scene garden, they argued, had forced them to see what they had accepted for too long. The board tried to regain control, gavels striking wood, voices rising above the crowd. But the momentum was gone. The room belonged not to them, but to the people they had ruled. And then came the vote. Ballots were distributed, collected, counted. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by the shuffle of papers. When the numbers were announced, the result was undeniable. The board had been voted out. Their reign was over. Cheers erupted, shouts filling the hall, neighbors hugging, reporters rushing to record the moment. The HOA had fallen. The woman remained seated, unmoving, her expression unreadable. She did not celebrate, did not smile. She simply rose, turned, and walked out into the night. The next morning, her yard was quiet. The mannequins remained broken, the tape shredded, the soil scarred. But for the first time in months, no letters arrived, no contractors appeared, no threats loomed. The war was finished. And yet, the garden itself remained a monument. Visitors still came, curious to see the infamous display. Strangers left flowers at the edge of the yard, treating it less like a disturbance and more like a memorial. Some saw it as art, others as defiance, but all agreed it was unforgettable. Weeks later, she finally began to clear it. Slowly, piece by piece, she removed the mannequins, the broken props, the chains. The soil was leveled, the cross dismantled, the outlines washed away by rain. What had once been a sanctuary, then a crime scene, then a battlefield, was returned to simple earth. But she did not replant roses or lavender. She did not rebuild the koi pond. Instead, she left the yard bare, the soil untouched, a silent reminder of what had happened there. To her, it no longer needed flowers. The garden's true growth had been something unseen, the courage of a community to confront control, the exposure of authority abused, the breaking of silence that had lingered for too long. Over time, the neighborhood settled. Without the board's constant interference, residents painted their doors new colors, planted gardens of their own, experimented with decorations long forbidden. The uniformity dissolved, replaced by individuality. Some loved it, others grumbled, but all acknowledged one truth: the neighborhood had changed forever. And at the center of that change was the woman, who had never raised her voice, never fought with fists or lawyers, but had instead turned grief into a message that no one could ignore. The crime scene garden was gone, but its legacy remained, etched not into the soil, but into the memory of everyone who had witnessed it. The HOA had destroyed her sanctuary, but in trying to silence her, they had given her the loudest voice of all. And though her yard was empty, it was far from barren. It held the weight of a story, the kind that outlives flowers, outlives rules, outlives even the people who first told it. It had become legend. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.